Okay, I want to moan about Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. I wanted to moan about it where I saw it about a month ago, um, and I didn't. I wasn't making videos at the time. And then I've watched House of the Dragon, which was ace, 1,000 times better. I only realised how bad Rings of Power was after I watched House of the Dragon. But I already had these moans, and I finally decided, yeah, I'm just going to sort of say what I wanted to say, really. And you can tell me what you think of what I say. I'm certainly not the first person to moan about this. One thing I do know, because I've seen it in the media, is that there's only certain things you're allowed to moan about, and there's certainly some things you're not allowed to moan about. Because if you moan about them, right, there's some areas where you cannot have legitimate criticisms. Otherwise, you're a sexist and a racist, and that's the sort of bottom line. But that seems quite absurd here, and I think there are some legitimate criticisms to make in those areas. So I want to discuss that. I'm gonna go there here. But there was like the whole series was like so thin. The characters were so thin. The development was so thin. I felt like after I'd watched that series, then watched House of the Dragon, it's like I'd covered one eye. You know, you cover one eye for a couple of minutes and then let go, and everything sort of pops into 3D all of a sudden. That's what it felt like. The difference between those two series, and it didn't make any sense. There was stuff like the sort of Numenorian trip to save the humans in those sort of southeastern lands that become Mordor eventually, of course. And they're sort of setting off there. And when they set off, you think, well, there's nowhere they can make it because they've only got about 24 hours to make a journey that's going to take about a week. And yet they somehow come galloping along in their horses to just the right village at just the right moment. And it's like things like that. I thought, like, what were the when you the way you write a script for these things is that you write the script for all the episodes, right? And so it all fits. Why didn't they just write it so that they set off earlier? Right? Why didn't they just write it so they were setting off like an episode before? It made no sense. It's almost as if they were filming it as they were writing it, and then they sort of went, "Oh Christ, we should have had the Numenorians set off last week." Well, doesn't matter. We'll just sort of gloss over that and just assume that their ships go, at 500 knots and their horses race at 100 miles an hour. Just think, why did it have to be like that? Why did the Harfoots go on this huge sort of 6 monthly or whatever it is? They eat snails and they eat apples, seemingly. They're the only two things that they eat. And they will travel on a migration, which on the map look like hundreds of miles, with these gigantic hand carts, which they're just dragging like... I mean, you'd be able to drag them for about half a mile if you were, normal 6 foot human size, big people size, and yet they drag them for hundreds of miles over all this danger for a few apples, for crying out loud. I didn't, it just seemed inexplicable. And again, with this bizarre sort of, the guy's injured his ankle, and there's no mechanism to deal with that. And so he's injured his ankle. If he can't keep up, he'll just be left to die. And it looked like they were going to tackle that in the episode. They said, "Oh well, yes, people have been left behind before. Let's go through the list of the people that have been left behind before," and they were all for significant things. Like one of them was stung by bees, I think, but they were all for there was never somebody because they twisted their ankle or they had an ingrown toenail or they just got a little bit too old to pull their cart. The list would be hundreds long, wouldn't it, over the centuries? Because it just seems if you can't pull your cart, well, that's it, you're just left to die. It just seemed really odd. Again, it made no sense whatsoever. There was so much of that. As I was watching it, every episode, there was something that I thought, it wasn't just that you had to suspend disbelief, but it's that you didn't really need to. They could have done it differently in each and every case. Okay, so that was the general things. So then there was the Galadriel. Let's talk about Galadriel, and then I'll talk about the sort of race side of it. The thing with the Galadriel character, I've seen a few people talk about that and say they didn't like her, Morpeth Clark or something, I think she's called. They didn't like her acting. I didn't mind her acting, actually. That didn't really bother me. The whole character made me wince. Right from the start, I said to my wife, let's watch this Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. I think it's going to be good. And right at the start, I was wincing. There's her in a group and they've got these picks. And they're like scaling this ice wall with these picks, and it made me cringe, to be quite. It was so ridiculously over the top. It made me cringe. There was no realism. The realism had already gone. Why would you they'd all be falling to their deaths, for crying out loud. I mean, and then they get to the top and they're fighting this cave troll, the kind of thing that in the Lord of the Rings films, it took all of them. It took Gandalf and Legolas and Aragorn. They all had to fight it to take down. And this cave troll just wipes all of her colleagues out, right? And then she just single-handedly slays it. And I get it. I get this idea that, this sort of diversity thing, and we need to show strong, powerful female characters. But there has to be a bit of a limit to it, doesn't there? I mean, I remember one of the feminist criticisms a few years back was unrealistic female armour. Male characters have realistic armour, female characters have revealing, booby sort of armour. We want the realism. But what's the realism here? There needs to be some accounting for size, doesn't there? I mean, it's like the mechanics of this was the same as the mechanics of a video, like a fighting game, like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, where it doesn't matter what size the character is. You can have a small character who's like a waif-like sort of schoolgirl type playing against sort of Zangief with muscles on his muscles, weighing about 6 times as much, and yet they're as powerful as one another. The small little waif female character can still pick him up and throw him. It's ridiculous, but it's a fighting game. The mechanics of the game means that every character has to be evenly balanced with every other, otherwise you just pick the strong character and win every time. We understand that, but that doesn't have to be the case here, and yet it's almost like the same mechanics are taking place. And once I was watching House of the Dragon, it made me think back to Game of Thrones, the original series, and how they did it with, I've looked the name up, Brienne of Tarth, who was played by Gwendolyn Christie, right? And that was a similar character in a way, I suppose. And it was a strong female knight, right? But she wasn't ridiculously strong. If she was up against a huge guy, she was still at a physical disadvantage. The program would sort of acknowledge that, and she'd have to use her wiles, fight a bit dirty, use all her skills, etc., etc. And the thing was that the actress who played her was 6'3". Right, it was about the biggest woman that they could find to make it realistic. Morpeth Clark, I looked her height up, he's 5'3". It's just, I try and suspend my disbelief, but they tried to get the most slender, beautiful woman to play Galadriel, and it just doesn't fit in with this, like, uber warrior who's like stronger and a better sword fighter than any other man in the world, than any man or elf, male elf or whatever in the entire world. It beggars belief. That's stretching it a little bit too far. And I did object. I like the character. If you wanted that character, create somebody new, because it almost kind of tarnishes the Galadriel character for me. I'm minded, having read Lord of the Rings, the books, right? I've read those books, I've watched the films. Maybe my mind now is more influenced by the films than the books, so I'm seeing the sort of Cate Blanchett Galadriel, and it's just such a ridiculously different character. I can't imagine this character going into that character, right? It's sort of, you're going to this sort of ethereal wizardy woman, but this character is just this ridiculously overpowered tiny little waif who's a better swords person than anybody else in the world. It's just a load of bollocks, quite frankly. And like, if so, you've got to, you can't have it both ways. If you want the tiny little beautiful female lead, then for me it doesn't work that she's this incredibly powerful warrior. You need a woman who looks like an incredibly powerful warrior if that's what you want. Okay, the race thing. So that was the other sort of bone of contention that people have. The other thing where, oh, if you've got a bit of a problem, then, you know, you must be a racist. But I didn't have a problem with some of it. The sort of mixed race guy who played the elf, I thought he was great, one of the best characters in there. That didn't seem out of place. There's lots of elves. I know there's different sort of wood elves and the different elves from Rivendell and all this lot. So I could imagine that. That didn't seem ridiculous to me. The dwarf woman, that didn't seem impossible to me, because obviously there's lots of different groups of dwarfs and all that lot. But what it did do, all these things, is that in some cases it did make it kind of difficult to know. Like the new Minorians, which are some sort of particular group, ethnic group of very, very sort of supermen, aren't they? I'd expect some kind of ethnic homogeneity there, right? That's what I would expect from that. But the woman who was like their queen was mixed race, I think, or black. I'm not sure which. Definitely mixed race, because she wasn't. Maybe she was North African, or maybe she's mixed race. I don't know. And there was a couple of others. I think Isildur, his father there was white, but he wasn't. He's a kind of mixed race actor, and it just didn't like. I do think that we take our cues. What most series have done for some reason, some good reason, is they've said, right, we'll have this group played by people who are Northern European, this group by people who are Southern European, this group played by people who are Asian. And it makes some sense then, because you get a visual cue of when it's jumping from one group to another, who it is you're dealing with. It's very difficult. It's almost as if the writers have gone, right, let's Google on Wikipedia what the demographics of New York City is, and then we'll make sure that every single group has the same demographic. I mean, obviously not, because otherwise there'd always be a lot more Asians. When we're talking about diversity, let's call a spade, we mean black people. That's all. That's the only group that anybody's really interested in when it comes to sport and representation, or media and representation. There's twice as many Asians in the UK as there are black people in the UK, but it's always like, will the next Doctor Who be black? Will the next James Bond be black? Well, why not Asian? Right? Surely that's your go-to first, but of course it isn't. Anyway, let's not worry about that. The point is that when you're looking at these things, you want those visual cues. In House of the Dragon, the Targaryens were all white with this blonde hair. The Valyrians were all black, right, pretty much. And that worked for me. I didn't have a problem. I didn't go, oh, the Valyrians were all black. I could stand that. That made some sense, because I could see it gave me some visual cues as to how I was dealing with. I didn't have this metropolitan London / New York style melting pot thing going on, where I couldn't tell where anybody come from in any way, shape or form, which was what was going on here. And the Harfoots were the most ludicrous example of this that I think I've ever seen. The Harfoots were this group, which it looked like there were about 30 or 40 of them, right? So, and they are very isolated, aren't they? They're just a small population. You could say in many ways they're like the pygmy tribes that we have around the world. The pygmy tribe is a tribe where the average adult male human height is under 5 foot. And there are these pygmy tribes around the world, most of them in Africa. I think a couple that qualify in part of Asia or something like that, right? But there is a result of sort of some evolutionary isolation. That's what's happened, because they're humans, believe it or not. And apparently Harfoots are humans. If you look at the Tolkien's lore, that's where hobbits and the Harfoots and all that came from. They are actually humans. It's not like the dwarves and the elves. They've descended from humans. So they are analogous, absolutely, to humans. And you've got this tiny little population. And yet There's this such... Where's the diversity coming from there? I'm going to show you a picture on screen of some people from a pygmy tribe, right? Get it in your head. This is from a pygmy tribe in Africa. I think you've already got the picture in your head. You're not picturing somebody from looks like they're from Northern Europe. Somebody who looks like they're from Asia, right? And then somebody who looks like they're from sub-Saharan Africa. They're all going to look pretty much the same. And here's the picture. And yes, they all look pretty... There's a never mind skin colour. There's a sort of familial resemblance there, isn't there? And that is what you would expect with these, isn't it? And yet it was quite baffling. It just detracted from it that there was sort of Lenny Henry, and then there was some who was sort of mixed race. I had to go back to check because I could have sworn that I'd seen a couple of East Asian looking Harfoots when they were doing when they were on their migration, and yes, there was a couple of East Asian Harfoots. Here's a picture to prove it. And so, like, where does that come from? Now, look, does it ruin the whole show? Can I suspend my disbelief yet again here and allow for it? I can, but it does detract from it. Right, it's you've gained nothing there. It's just something that you didn't have to do, that you did. They clearly did just for the sake of it, just to show, oh, let's be so diverse that even this tiny little group where you wouldn't expect any diversity whatsoever, even that's going to look like that we've just picked people randomly off the street from New York City or London and shrunk them down to size. You know, it's going to look like a modern, Western, major urban area, which is just, frankly, in my view, absolutely ridiculous. And the tragedy is, right, I'd have been absolutely happy if you look at what Tolkien writes about the Harfoots. They are a group of sort of proto-hobbits, and they are said to have been of darker skin than all the other groups. So, like, they could have had sort of black actors and actresses to play all of them. And you know, that for me would have been absolutely fine. 100% totally fine. What, you know, no issues whatsoever with that. But instead we had this ridiculous mix that, like I say, all these things are small in themselves, but there's just no need for it. It really does seem like it's sort of ramming it down your throat to make some kind of a point. You could have increased the diversity quite considerably in this show, but still have kept some separation, so it looked like so it gave you those visual cues, and so it kind of represented what you would expect to see from a society that like this, which is not like our modern world where people are jetting across all over the place and all mixing and living in different things. And yet even in our societies today, it doesn't look like that. You go to China and you see, you know, a load of people in China, they all look the same. You go to most parts of Africa, most of the people are going to look the same. Most of the places around the world, 95 to 99% of the people you're going to see there are all going to look pretty much the same. They don't look like these great big inner cities, and yet even the smallest groups, the groups you'd least expect to look like that in this, had to look like that for some reason. And to me, that's just, it's taking it too far, right? Whatever your aim is, yeah, we need more diversity in these things, fine, but please use a bit of common sense when you do it. We need some stronger female characters, fine, but use a bit of common sense. They don't have to be the most physically overpowered character in the entire series, surely, right? Give us some fucking magical powers or something to make up for this fact that she's 5'3", right, and about, I don't know, 8 stone wet through, I would say. Just use a bit of common sense, I think, with these things. Okay, that's it. Off my chest now. I am interested to know, am I out of order with this, right? Is it simply true that if you bring these things up, well, then obviously, yeah, you really are racist. And you should just be, watch these totally colourblind. It shouldn't matter what colour of skin each actor is, regardless of what role they're playing, you should just kind of see through it. Or is there a little bit of common sense that we need to employ here? Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.